The Dolt by Donald Barthelme. Edgar was preparing to take the National Writers' Examination, a 5-hour, 50-minute examination for his certificate. He was in his room, frightened. The prospect of taking the exam again put him in worlds of hurt. He had taken it twice before, with evil results. Now he was studying a book which contained not the actual questions from the examination, but similar questions. "Barbara, if I don't knock it for a loop this time, I don't know what we'll do." Barbara continued to address herself to the ironing board. Edgar thought about saying something to his younger child, his 2-year-old daughter Rose, who was wearing a white terry-cloth belted bathrobe and looked like a tiny fighter about to climb into the ring. They were all in the room while he was studying for the examination. "The written part is where I fall down," Edgar said morosely to everyone in the room. "The oral part is where I do best." He looked at the back of his wife, which was pointed at him. "If I don't kick it in the head this time, I don't know what we're going to do," he repeated. "Barb?" But she failed to respond to this implied question. She felt it was a false hope, taking this examination, which he had already failed miserably twice, and which always got him very worked up, black with fear, before he took it. Now she didn't wish to witness the spectacle any more, so she gave. "The oral part," Edgar continued encouragingly, "is A-OK. I can, for instance, give you a list of answers. I know it so well. Listen, here is an answer. Can you tell me the question?" Barbara, who was very sexually attractive, that was what made Edgar tap her for a date many years before, but also deeply mean, said nothing. She put her mind on the silent child, Rose. "Here is the answer," Edgar said. "The answer is Julia Ward Howe. What is the question?" The answer was too provocative for Barbara to resist long, because she knew the question. "Who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic?" she said. "There is not a grown person in the United States who doesn't know that." "You're right," Edgar said unhappily, for he would have preferred that the answer been a little more recherché, one that she would not have known the question to. But she had been a hooker for a period before their marriage, and he could resort to this area if her triumph grew too great. "Do you want to try another one?" "Edgar, I don't believe in that examination anymore," she told him coldly. "I don't believe in you, Barbara," he countered. This remark filled her with remorse and anger. She considered momentarily letting him have one upside the head, but fear prevented her from doing it, so she turned her back again and thought about the vaunted certificate. With a certificate, he could write for all the important and great periodicals, and there would be some money in the house for a change instead of what they got from his brother and the unemployment. "It isn't you who has to pass the National Writers' Examination," he shot past her. Then, to mollify, he gave her another answer. "Brand, Tuck, Glaive, Claymore." "Is that an answer?" she asked from behind her back. "It is indeed. What's the question?" "I don't know," she admitted, slightly pleased to be put back in a feminine position of not knowing. "Those are 4 names for a sword. They're archaic." "That's why I don't know them, then." "Obviously," said Edgar with some malice, for Barbara was sometimes given to saying things that were obvious, just to fill the air. "You put a word like that in now and then to freshen your line," he explained. "Even though it's an old word, it's so old it's new. But you have to be careful. The context has to let people know what the thing is. You don't want to be simply obscure." He liked explaining the tricks of the trade to Barb, who made some show of interest in them. "Do you want me to read you what I've written for the written part?" Barb said yes, with a look of pain, for she still felt acutely what he was trying to do. "This is the beginning," Edgar said, preparing his yellow manuscript paper. "What is the title?" Barbara asked. She had turned to face him. "I haven't got a title yet," Edgar said. "Okay, this is the beginning." He began to read aloud. "In the town of A, in the district of Y, there lived a certain Madame A, wife of Baron A, who was in the service of the young Frederick II of Prussia. The Baron, a man of uncommon ability, is chiefly remembered for his notorious and inexplicable blunder at the Battle of Kolin. By withdrawing the column under his command at a crucial moment in the fighting, he earned for himself the greatest part of the blame for Frederick's defeat, which resulted in a loss, on the Prussian side, of 13,000 out of 33,000 men. Now, as it happened, the chateau in which Madame A was sheltering lay not far from the battlefield. In fact, the removal of her husband's corps placed the chateau itself in the gravest danger. And at the moment Madame A learned from a Captain Orsini of her husband's death by his own hand, she was also told that a detachment of Pandours, the brutal and much feared Hungarian light irregular cavalry, was hammering at the gates. Edgar paused to breathe. Barb looked at him with some surprise. "The beginning turns me on," she said. "More than usual, I mean." She began to have some faint hope, and sat down on the sofa bed. "Thank you," Edgar said. "Do you want me to read you the development?" "Go ahead." Edgar drank some water from a glass near to hand. The man who brought this terrible news enjoyed a particular status in regard to the lady. He was her lover, and he was not. Giacomo Orsini, second son of a noble family of Siena, had, as a young man, a religious vocation. He had become a priest, not the grander sort of priest who makes a career in Rome and in great houses, but a modest village priest in the north of his country. Here befell him a singular misfortune. It was the pleasure of Frederick Wilhelm I, father of the present ruler, to assemble, as is well known, the finest army in Europe. Tiny Prussia was unable to supply men in sufficient numbers to satisfy this ambition. His recruiters ranged over the whole of Europe, and those whom they could not persuade with promises of liberal bounties into the king's service, they kidnapped. Now, Frederick was above all else fond of very tall men, and had created for his personal guard a regiment of giants, much mocked at the time, but none the less a brave and formidable sight. It was the bad luck of the priest Orsini to be a very tall man, and of impressive mien and bearing withal. He was abducted straight from the altar. As he was saying Mass, the host, in his hands— "This is very exciting," Barb broke in, her eyes showing genuine pleasure and excitement. "Thank you," Edgar said, and continued his reading. "And served 10 years in the regiment of giants. On the death of Frederick Wilhelm, the regiment was disbanded, among other economies, but the former priest, by now habituated to military life, and even zestful for it, enlisted under the new young king with the rank of captain." "Is this historically accurate?" Barbara asked. "It does not contradict what is known," Edgar assured her. Assigned to the staff of Baron A, and much in the latter's house in consequence, he was thrown in with the lovely Ingi, Madame A, a woman much younger than her husband, and possessed of many excellent qualities. A deep sympathy established itself between them, with this idiosyncrasy, that it was never pressed to a conclusion on his part, or acknowledged in any way on hers, but both were aware that it existed, and drew secret nourishment from it, and took much delight in the nearness one to the other. But this pleasant state of affairs also had a melancholy aspect, for Orsini, although exercising the greatest restraint in the matter, nevertheless considered that he had, in even admitting to himself that he was in love with Madame A, damaged his patron, the Baron, whom he knew to be a just and honorable man, and one who had, moreover, done him many kindnesses. In this humor, Orsini saw himself as a sort of jackal skulking around the periphery of his benefactor's domestic life, which had been harmonious and whole, but was now, in whatsoever slight degree, compromised. Rose, the child, stood in her white bathrobe looking at her father, who was talking for such a long time, and in such a dramatic, shaking voice. The Baron, on his side, was not at all insensible of the passion that was present, as it were in a condition of latency, between his young wife and the handsome Sienese. In truth, his knowledge of their intercourse, which he imagined had ripened far beyond the point it had actually reached, had flung him headlong into a horrible crime. For his withholding of the decisive troops at Kolin, for which history has judged him so harshly, was neither an act of strategy nor a display of pusillanimity, but a willful act, having as its purpose the exposure of the chateau, and thus the lovers, whom he had caused to be together there, to the bloodlust of the Pandours. And as for his alleged suicide, that too was a cruel farce. He lived in a hidden place. Edgar stopped. It's swift moving, Barbara complimented. Well, do you want me to read you the end? The end? Is it the end already? Do you want me to read you the end? He repeated. Yes. I've got the end, but I don't have the middle, Edgar said, a little ashamed. You don't have the middle? Do you want me to read you the end, or don't you? Yes, read me the end. The possibility of a semi-professional apartment, which she had entertained briefly, was falling out of her head with this news, that there was no middle. The last paragraph is this. During these events, Frederick, to console himself for the debacle at Cologne, composed in his castle at Berlin a flute sonata, of which the critic Guilda had said that it is not less lovely than the sonatas of Georges Philippe Telemann. That's ironic, she said knowingly. Yes, Edgar agreed, impatient. He was as volatile as a popcorn. But what about the middle? I don't have the middle, he thundered. Something has to happen between them. Ingy and what's-his-name, she went on. Otherwise there's no story. Looking at her, he thought, she is still streety, although wearing her housewife gear. The child was a perfect love, however, and couldn't be told from the children of success. Barb then began telling a story she knew that had happened to a friend of hers. The girl had had an affair with a man and had become pregnant. The man had gone off to Seville to see if hell was a city much like it, and she had spontaneously aborted in Chicago. Then she had flown over to Parley, and they had walked in the streets and visited elderly churches and like that. And the first church they went into, there was this tiny little white coffin covered with flowers right in the sanctuary. Banal, Edgar pronounced. She tried to think of another anecdote to deliver to him. I've got to get this certificate, he suddenly called out desperately. I don't think you can pass the National Writers' Examination with what you have on that paper, Barb said then, with great regret, because even though he was her husband, she didn't want to hurt him unnecessarily. But she had to tell the truth, without a middle. I wouldn't have been great, even with the certificate, he said. Your views would have become known. You would have been something. At that moment, the Sun-Manqué entered the room. The Sun-Manqué was 8 feet tall and wore a serape woven out of 200 transistor radios, all turned on and tuned to different stations. Just by looking at him, you could hear Portland and Nogales, Mexico. No grass in the house. Barbara got the grass, which was kept in one of those little yellow and red metal canisters made for sending film back to Eastman Kodak. Edgar tried to think of a way to badmouth this immense sun leaning over him like a large, blaring building, but he couldn't think of anything. Thinking of anything was beyond him. I sympathize. I myself have these problems. Endings are elusive. Middles are nowhere to be found. But worst of all is to begin, to begin, to begin.